Okay, so we're ready for Bible survey.
Yes, you had told me to go through chapter 12.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. I'll just do kind of an introduction to Exodus here first, and
Okay.
we'll get to that part. So Exodus means the going forth. It's about the Israelites leaving Egypt. So if you remember back in Exodus, God gave Abraham a prophecy. He says, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that's not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterwards they will come out with great possession." So God spoke this to Abraham over 400 years before Joseph and Jacob went down into Egypt. They're going to be there 400 years. So they were slaves, basically slaves. We're not sure how much time they were slaves. As long as they remembered Joseph, they were allowed to just live in the lands. But later on, the Pharaoh made them into slaves.
Yeah.
So basically, Exodus is divided into two sections. Exodus 1 to 19 is the Exodus from Egypt, and then Exodus 20 to 40 is the giving of the law. So we have the two sections that Exodus is divided up into. So in Exodus 2, we find that God's deliverer, Moses, was born. And at that time, the Israelites had grown, and there were getting to be many of them. And so the Egyptian leader, Pharaoh, he decided he had to start killing some of them. He had to stop them from growing so much. So they started to take the babies and throw them into the Nile when they were born, and putting them to death. But Moses' mother and father saw that he was a good child, and so they saved him, put him in a little basket, and he went out floating. And so here it tells us in Exodus 23, "Now it happened in the process of time, the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out. Their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and he acknowledged them." God heard their groaning. He heard the trials that they were under, and he determined to send them a deliverer, and that's who Moses was. So Moses was born, survived, and so after that he was put in a little basket, and while he was in that little basket, the princess came and found him floating in the Nile and took him out. So that's why she called him Moses. Moses means to draw out. So she drew him out of the water, and he became her son. And so he grew up in all the power of Egypt, and he studied under the best teachers in Egypt, learned all the military strategy and all the things that Egypt knows. So he grew up under that. But then, as you know the story, he started to think about his people that were under bondage. And so one day he went out and he killed an Egyptian and buried him in the sand. And it was known. So Moses had to get away. And so he left and went into the land of Moab. He found a wife there, stayed 40 years in the backside of the desert, looking after the sheep. So we see Moses' life is divided into 40 years. So he was 40 years in Egypt. Then he was 40 years on the backside of the desert, looking after the sheep. And then he was 40 years leading Israel. So his life was divided into three sections, 40 years.
So are you saying by the time God sent Moses back to Pharaoh, he was already 80 years old?
That's right. Yeah. Okay, so one day he's walking on the backside of the desert looking after the sheep, and he sees a burning bush, and this bush is burning and doesn't burn up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, the Lord called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here am I. And he said, Do not draw near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place that you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look on God. So here Moses begins to speak to, our God begins to speak to Moses. Now, the 40 years in the backside of the desert was important. It was a training. God trained Moses in those times and taught him to be humble. Okay, he didn't learn humility in Egypt. The world doesn't teach us humility, it teaches us pride. And so he had the pride of all his knowledge and learning. And then God sent him into the backside of the desert to teach him humility. And Moses became a very meek man. And so probably thought, during those 40 years, well, my life is over. This is all I'm destined to do is look after these sheep, and that's it. God had a plan. And so God calls him here and tells him he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he wants him to do something. So in verse 13, Moses says, Indeed, I come to the children of Israel to say to them, God of your fathers has sent me. And they say to me, What is his name? You shall say to, what shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Thus shall you say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So when we go through the Old Testament particularly, and even in the New Testament, we see God revealing himself in different names. And so after this, we see God revealing himself as Jehovah. And then there's a number of names of God that relate to Jehovah. But this is the name that he gave to Moses. I am who I am. And basically this means I'm the absolute, unchanging, eternal God. Now, this is what we saw in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created, right? God always existed. He was absolute. He's unchanging. He has always been there. So when he says, I am, that's who he was describing himself. Basically, he says, I am complete in myself. I don't need you. I don't need anybody. I am God. But I choose to use people. And so God chose to use Abraham and Moses in this particular situation. And he is the I am. And basically saying everything owes its existence to me. Okay. And so this is God that we serve. And we should never get too big of a picture of ourselves. Never think that we're more important than we are. We are nothing in a sense. God is everything. He doesn't need us, but he chooses to use us. And so that's what he was showing Abraham here, or Moses here, I should say. And it's really interesting because Jesus calls himself or uses the word I am numerous times in the New Testament. So Jesus makes 7 I am statements. First he says, I am the bread of life. Okay. So he's using this from the book of Exodus, where God calls himself the I am, and Jesus describes himself, I am the bread of life. In other words, the picture of bread was that which sustains life. That's which people need to survive. And Jesus says, I am that bread of life. You cannot survive me. Then he says, I am the light of the world. And so we live in darkness. We're destined to darkness without Jesus. I am the door of the sheep. Jesus is that one that stands and brings us protection. I am the resurrection and the life. So Jesus is the one that takes us out of death, brings us to life. And ultimately, he is the door that's going to take us from this natural life that we live and take us into eternal life forever and ever. I am the good shepherd, he says in John 10. And so that puts him in the place of the good shepherd that we see in Psalm 23 as well. And he cares for us, he feeds us, after us. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Okay. And that's quite a statement. Jesus is the truth. Okay. And so there no other source of truth except him, source of life. He is a source of how we are going to life. Finally, he says, I am the true vine. So in John 15, he tells us, draw everything from him. It says, without me, you can do nothing. If we go away from the vine, he says, we'll just dry up and we're ready to be burned. But when we stay plugged into Jesus, that's where life is. So this is what God was speaking to Moses in the same way. I am the source of all things. So as long as you stay plugged into me, as long as you walk with me, I will work through you. And so Moses understood how to be meek. He understood how to be humble, how to draw everything from God. Now, Moses goes back to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to do it. God gave him a few signs, like throwing his snake on, or his stick on the ground, it became a snake. And also putting his hand inside his robe and pulling it out, became leprous, and put it back in, it became normal. So we see these different signs that God gave Moses, and through that, the Israelites realized that God had sent him. Also, he did them for Pharaoh, but Pharaoh hardened his heart. So we find that there's these 10 plagues, and 10 means fullness or completion. So through these 10 plagues, God was going to punish Pharaoh and Egypt. And Pharaoh hardened his heart 10 times, resulting in this full judgment of Egypt. And it's a picture of, people who harden their hearts against the gospel as well. God says, I will destroy them. So the first plague, and each of these plagues actually dealt with one of the gods of Egypt. Okay. And so the first one is Hapi, which is the Egyptian god of the Nile. So there we see a picture of that god. He was the Egyptian water bearer. So that's what he's doing. He's bearing a couple of cups of water there. And so the first plague was God turned the water into blood. He turned the Nile into blood. And so God demonstrated his power over this God, that the God of the universe, God that Moses was presenting, was greater than the God of the Nile. And the second god was the Egyptian goddess of fertility and water and renewal, and it was Heket. And it had the head of a frog. Okay, so you can see this picture here where the god has a head of a frog. And so the second plague was Moses brought up frogs out of the Nile and just covered the land. They were in their houses, they were in their beds, they were in their food, frogs everywhere. Okay, you can tell it would be pretty gross. And so Pharaoh comes along and says, remove this plague. Well, God just allowed the frogs to die, and then they piled them up in big piles and it began to stink. So again, God showed his power over this particular god, the god Heket. Now the next one is God of the earth, named Geb, and it was over the dust of the earth. Moses called forth lice out of the dust of the earth, and all these lice got on the people and started biting them, and horrible. And so he demonstrated his power over this particular god. The next one was the god of creation, Khepri, and the movement of the sun and rebirth. And it was an Egyptian god that had the head of a fly. And so the next plagues were swarms of flies. And those flies covered the earth. And again, it was a demonstration of God's power over this particular god. The next one was the Egyptian goddess of love and protection, Hathor. And usually this goddess was depicted with the head of a cow. Okay, in this particular picture, it's a human head, but often it had the picture of a cow. And so God sent a plague upon the cattle and the livestock of Egypt. But he made a separation between Egypt and the children of Israel. Their cattle didn't die. It was only the Egyptians' cattle that died. Again, demonstrating his power over this god. And there was Iris, the goddess of medicine and peace. And so the plague was, he took a handful of ashes out of the furnace, threw it up, and all the Egyptians broke out with boils and sores because of that. But Pharaoh would not soften his heart. Now, sometimes he started to make little compromises. He said, well, you can go, just the men get to go. Moses said, no, that's not good enough. Then he said, well, you can take your children, but you can't take any of your animals. No, not good enough. And so he tried to make compromise, but God wanted full obedience. Then we have Nut, the Egyptian goddess of the sky. And God caused hail to rain down, and it came down like fire. So it must have lightning with it, ran across the ground. So it just destroyed the crops. Then there was the god of storms and disorder, and God sent locusts down from the sky. And these locusts ate everything that was there. Then there was a sun god, Ra. That was one of the major deities of the Egyptians. And so God sent a plague of complete darkness for 3 days. It was so dark, you could feel, it was like feel the darkness. And yet in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there was light. And then there was Pharaoh. Pharaoh, they considered a god. He was the ultimate power of Egypt. And so the last plague was the killing of the firstborn, that the angel of death was going to come into every house. And even in Pharaoh's house, his firstborn son died. And so that was the ultimate plague, and that was the ultimate end, where Pharaoh said, okay, we've had enough. Get out of here. Everybody go. We want you out of here. And so that's when they were told that they needed to leave. And then God had prepared them for that. They had got all their stuff already packed up. They had their some food with them, and they were ready to go. And they also spoiled the Egyptians. God gave them favor with the Egyptians, and they were able to borrow gold and silver and precious stones and all these things. And God said that that was their wages for the years that they had worked with slaves. And so they left with all that money or valuables. Okay, so God can demonstrate his power over the gods of the earth. And he does this, often. He shakes kingdoms, he shakes economic systems, he shakes everything that man trusts in. And that's being happened in the world that we live in today. God is shaking the gods of this world. And people have put their trust in doctors, they've put their trust in governments and finances. And all these things are being shaken right now. And God is demonstrating his power over these gods. Okay, so that brings us to Exodus chapter 12. And we asked you to find the symbols that relate to Jesus and his sacrifice for us and explain them as best you can. So what did you find there?
Let me ask you, Excuse me?
Yep.
Yes. You talked of Exodus 12 or Genesis 12?
Last week it was Genesis. This week it's Exodus. Did you do Genesis?
I did Genesis 12,
Oh, okay.
and there are things that I found and there are things I didn't find.
Mhm.
So, but still, I can go through it and then I
Sure.
can maybe share something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Let me try to read through. Is that okay?
Yep.
Yes. It's literally talking about Exodus 12, starting from 1. It's talking about literally the first Passover.
Yeah.
While the Israelites were still in the land of the Egypt, the Lord gave the following instructions to Moses and Aaron. From now on, this month will be the first month of the year for you. Announce to the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each family must choose a lamb or a young goat for a sacrifice. One animal for each household. If a family is too small to eat a whole animal, let them share it with other family in the neighborhood. Divide the animal according to the size of each family and how much they can eat. The animal you select must be a 1-year-old male, either a sheep or a goat with no defects. Take special care of this chosen animal until the evening of the 14th day of this first month. Then the whole assembly of the community of Israel must slaughter their lamb or young goat at twilight. They are to take some of the blood and smear it on the sides and top of the door frames of the houses where they eat the animal. That same night, they must roast the meat over a fire and eat it along with bitter salad greens and bread made without yeast. Do not eat any of the meat raw or boiled in water. The whole animal, including the head, legs, and internal organs, must be roasted over a fire. Do not leave any of it until the next morning. Burn whatever is not eaten before morning. These are your instructions for eating this meal. Be fully dressed, wear your sandals, and carry your walking stick in your hand. Eat the meal with urgency, for this is the Lord's Passover. On that night, I will pass through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn son and firstborn male animal in the land of Egypt. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. But the blood of your doorposts will serve as a sign marking the houses where you are staying. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. This plague of death will not touch you when I strike the land of Egypt. This is a day to remember. Each year, from generation to generation, you must celebrate it as a special festival to the Lord. This is a law for all time. For 7 days, the bread you eat must be made without yeast. On the first day of the festival, remove every trace of yeast from your homes. Anyone who eats bread made with yeast during the 7 days of the festival will be cut off from the community of Israel. On the first day of the festival, and again on the 7th day, all the people must observe an official day for holy assembly. No work of any kind may be done on these days, except in the preparation of food. Celebrate this festival of unleavened bread, for it will remind you that I brought your forces out of the land of Egypt on this very day. This festival will be permanent law for you. Celebrate this day from generation to generation. The bread you eat must be made without yeast. From the evening of the 14th day of the first month until the evening of the 21st day of that month. During those 7 days, there must be no trace of yeast in your homes. Anyone who eats anything made with yeast during this week will be cut off from the community of Israel. These regulations apply both to foreigners living among you and to the natives born Israelites. During those days, you must not eat anything made with yeast. Wherever you live, eat only bread made with yeast, without yeast, sorry. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel together and said to them, go pick out a lamb and a young goat for each of your families and slaughter the Passover animal. Drain the blood into a basin, then take a bundle of hyssop branches and dip it into the blood. Brush the hyssop across the top and sides of the door frames of your houses. And no one may go out through the door until morning, for the Lord will pass through the land to strike down the Egyptians. But when he sees the blood on the top and side of your door frame, the Lord will pass over your home. He will not permit his death angel to enter your house and strike you down. Remember, these instructions are permanent law that you and your descendants must observe forever. When you enter the land of the Lord, when you enter the land the Lord has promised to give you, will continue to observe this ceremony. Then your children will ask, what does this ceremony mean? And you will reply, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of Israelites in Egypt. And though he struck the Egyptians, he spared our families. When Moses had finished speaking, all the people bowed down to the ground and worshipped. So the people of Israel did just as the Lord had commanded through Moses and Aaron. And that night at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn sons in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn son of prisoner in the Dagon. Even the firstborn of their livestock were killed. Pharaoh and his officials and all the people of Egypt woke up during the night, and loud wailing was heard throughout the land of Egypt. There was not a single house where someone had not died. Israel's exodus from Egypt. Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron during the night. Get out, he ordered. Leave and take the rest of the Israelites with you. Go and worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you said, and be gone. Go, but bless me as you leave. All the Egyptians urged the people of Israel to get out of the land as quickly as possible, for they thought, we will all die. The Israelites took their bread duff before yeast was added. They wrapped their kneading boards in their cloaks and carried them on their shoulders. And the people of Israel did as Moses had instructed. They asked the Egyptians for the clothing and articles of silver and gold. The Lord caused the Egyptians to look favorably on the Israelites, and they gave the Israelites whatever they asked for. So they stripped the Egyptians of their wealth. That night, the people of Israel left.
That's good enough.
Okay.
Yeah. So what do you think? Where do you see Jesus in that?
Yes. When we're discussing previously about the encounter or some of the covenants that God has had with man, we've talked about presence, provision, and protection previously. So these are the very things I want to use to highlight some of these things in this very chapter.
Good.
Yes. Literally, when I look at when the angel of death coming in to kill all the firstborn of all the Egyptians, this is a strategy that the Lord used to scare the Egyptians and put them down to allow his people to live and go.
Yeah.
You know. Yes, and this first, if you go, if you look at at which chapter is that? God is trying to urge his people that if you're to be spared, you need to slaughter your firstborn animals or goat, either sheep, and then you smear on the top, on the sides of your walls, so that when the angel of death passes by in the night, you will be spared. So I look at it as God's protection upon his people, regardless of the anger and the mission that was on the table of killing all the firstborns. He had a way out how to protect his own, and that was the way he did it. And then when you also talk about the kind of fear that grew into the hearts of the Egyptians, that pushed them to surrender every wealth they had to these people of Israel as they left. So I see that as provision.
Yeah.
It's like they give them a package that would push them through the wilderness, through the journey to the promised land where they were heading. Yes. And then literally, I just see the presence of God everywhere, because he cannot communicate if he's not present.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm seeing communications throughout the whole chapter. So that is a good sign to show that there was a presence of God, because that's what made it possible for them to communicate, Yes.
Good. That's good. Excellent.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
So you found those three things there. And like I say over and over again, in God's covenant, those things are seen. And we recognize those things. So that's awesome. Okay.
Thank you.
And so here's the picture of what you were talking about, where you put the blood on the top of the doorpost and the two sides. And they were to do that as protection from the angel of death that was going to come and bring that to all the different things. Great. Okay. Now, there are certain things that points to us, particularly with this animal, this lamb that they killed. It points to us about Jesus. So the first thing it tells us in verse 4 is that the lamb was chosen by the father of the household. Okay. And so Jesus, of course, was chosen before the foundation of the world. Jesus was the planned deliverer. He was the one that was chosen, that was going to come and deliver us. So this lamb being chosen by the Father speaks of Jesus as well. Then it says that they were to pick a lamb that was without blemish. Okay? It wasn't to have a broken leg. It wasn't to have any kind of spots or anything that would make it less valuable. And when we look at Jesus, we see that he was the sinless Son of God. He was the perfect lamb. Okay, so again, we see Jesus here is like this lamb that they had to pick. He was perfect. Then he was chosen, it was chosen in the prime of life. It was to be a 1-year-old lamb, which is, for a lamb, that's the prime of life. And Jesus was 33 years old when he became the sacrificed lamb. So the blood was applied to the doorposts. And, as you look at that, if you think of the cross with the nails in Jesus' hands, and of course the crown of thorns on his head and everything, we see that blood that flowed down the cross. And so that blood that we find in the cross saves us from death, from spiritual death, and ultimately gives us eternal life. So just as it saved the Israelites, that lamb saved the Israelites, that was a picture of Jesus coming to save us. And then it says in verse 13 that this angel of death would pass over the house. Okay, and so when we accept Jesus, when we accept his blood, when we accept his salvation, the angel of death has no power over us. And then ultimately it brought deliverance from their bondage. They were set free. And the Bible says that whom the Son sets free is free indeed. So we experience that through Jesus Christ. So these all point to Jesus as that same deliverer. So it tells us in Hebrews 9:22 that without shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. And so it was the blood of this lamb that protected them, and it's the blood of Jesus that removes our sin. And Jesus said in John 5:24, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life and shall not come into judgment, but has passed from death into life. So Jesus is that Passover lamb that we have, through him, we have passed over from death to life. The judgment that's coming on Egypt or the world, Egypt is always a type of the world. That judgment that comes on the world is not going to come on us. We've been set free. And so we will stand before God and he'll say, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been, because of the righteousness of my son, you will not come under judgment like the rest of the world. But those who stand before God without Jesus, they will be judged and take part in that second death. Okay, and then in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 7 and 8, Paul makes it very clear. He says, therefore purge out leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So Jesus, he says, is our Passover. He was the Passover lamb. So we don't have to do that anymore. And we partake of the unleavened bread. What he's speaking there is we don't have the old influences anymore. The leaven of sin, the leaven of wickedness, the leaven of malice. God has cleansed us from that. And we come in sincerity of come unto the Lord. Okay. So that's the picture of Jesus we find in that chapter. Okay, then in chapter 14, we see the parting of the Red Sea and the drowning of Pharaoh's army. So God, the Israelites, they leave Egypt, they head out. God leads them through the wilderness, and he takes them to the Red Sea, bring them to this place that seems like it's absolutely impossible. They can't go to the right, they can't go to the left, they can't go forward. They're stuck. And they cry out to God. God causes the cloud of smoke and fire to stand between them and the Egyptians, and he opens up the Red Sea, and they go through the Red Sea. And when they're all gone to the other side, Pharaoh starts chasing them, but his chariot wheels get stuck in the mud and start falling off, and God brings a sea down upon them and destroys them. Then in chapter 15, we see the song of Moses. And this is the waters of Merah, waters of bitterness. And these waters are bitter. And the children of Israel, they start to complain. They say, well, God, did you deliver us out of Egypt just to bring us into the land of, or into this wilderness so we just die of thirst? Okay. It kind of reminds us of what the devil said to Eve. God's holding out on you. God doesn't want you to partake of this tree because he knows if you do that, you're going to be wise as he is. And so Eve started to buy into that lie. And the children of Israel bought into that same lie. You know, if God loved them enough to bring them out of Egypt, if he did all these miracles and signs, can't he take care of them in the wilderness? But sometimes we're like that too. We're trusting God and everything's okay until we get into some kind of crunch. And then we think, oh, maybe God can't take me through this one. He's done all the rest, but I don't know if he can help me through this one, right?
Maybe this is too much for him.
That's right. So God shows Moses a tree, and he cuts down the tree and he throws it in the water. And again, this is a picture of the cross of Jesus Christ, where the cross of Jesus takes away the bitterness of sin. It takes away and this is what we see with the children of Israel. They're brought out of Egypt, but now God has to get Egypt out of them. Okay, and that's the process that we all live through, where God is working to get the sin out of us, the patterns of sin, the patterns of all those things that are not of God. And he has to get those patterns out. He has to put into us his life, his righteousness and his peace and joy. So we start living that out. And so that's what he had to work out of the children of Israel as well. He kind of had a slave mentality. And God wanted to teach them how to be children of God, kings and priests. Okay, then in chapter 16, we see the giving of manna. And this is a test of obedience. Okay, they're complaining now. They got the water, but now they don't have any food. Okay, and they start thinking back to all the food they had in Egypt, even though they were slaves. And there's something about us as human beings, we kind of are like that. We forget the bad parts and we start thinking about the good parts. You know, it's like you ever hear, I don't know if any of your elders talk about the good old days, you know, how things were better back there. That's what people tend to talk about. Do any of your elders ever talk about the good old days? You know, how
Talk about what?
the good old days? Kind of like back when I was a kid, you know, things were much better. We had this, we had that, and things were simpler and easier.
Yes.
But that tends to be human memory. We remember the good things, but we forget about the bad things. And there was just as much bad back then as there is now. So here the Israelites are saying, oh, you know, we love the food that we had back in Egypt, but they forgot that they were slaves. They were getting whipped. They had to work hard every day, you know. And so they complain. And God gets angry at complaining. He really got angry with them. But he says, okay, I'm going to give you a test. Every morning, I'm going to have manna show up. You're going to go out, you're going to pick up this stuff. It was like little bits of cotton or whatever. It was, but it was bread and it had a sweet taste. And so every day they were to pick it up and they were to just pick up enough for their family. He says, don't pick up more than you're going to eat that day because you can't keep it over. You can't keep it overnight. Each day you got to go out, you got to pick the manna. Every day, go pick the manna, except for Friday. Okay. Friday, there's going to be double because there's not going to be any manna on the Sabbath. Sabbath is to be a day of rest. So I'm going to give you double the amount Friday so that you can pick for 2 days and you can take, okay, not really difficult instructions, but right away, the first time somebody picked more than they need and they tried to keep it over, and the next day it was full of worms. It was all rotten. And the same thing on the Sabbath day, some people went out to try and pick some and there wasn't any there. Okay. God got mad at them and Moses got mad at them. They're being tested. Their obedience was being tested, but also their trust in God. Okay. God says, you know what? I'm going to just give you the supply day by day by day by day. And God wants us to trust him day by day by day by day. And yet that's a hard thing for us. We want to have not just enough for today, but we want enough for the rest of the month. We want to know that we're going to have enough. And so we sometimes, we often will worry and we'll struggle and we'll get all full of all kinds of anxiety. God says, no, that's not my plan. I want you to just trust me every day, every day, every day. Just trust me and know that I will supply, I will take care of you every day. And so just like they were tested, God tests us sometimes. Trust his supply, that he's taking care of us. So that was one of the challenges. Now, interestingly enough, over in John 6:32, Jesus said to them, most assuredly, I say to you, Moses did not give you bread from heaven, but my Father gives you true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said unto him, Lord, give us the bread always. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. So basically, Jesus is saying, you know what? That manna that Moses gave your fathers in the wilderness, that was just food. It just lasted one day. It wasn't the true bread from heaven. But Jesus says, I am the true bread from heaven. I'm the fulfillment of that manna. I am with you every day. I'm walking with you every day. I'm your good shepherd. I'm here to care for you. I'm here to feed you. I'm I'm here to take you from into green pastures and give you the pure water. I am the bread of life. So Jesus is seen even in the manna. He is the one that is that provision of bread for us. All right, then in chapter 17, again, they're complaining, we don't have any water, we don't have any water. And so God says, I want you to go to a rock that I show you, and I want you to hit the rock with a stick. Okay. And so Moses goes and he hits the rock with a stick, and water starts gushing out of this rock. So there's water, all the water that they need to refresh them. Now, in 1 Corinthians 10:4, it says, and they all drank of the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed him. That rock is Christ. Okay, why do you think striking the rock with a stick is similar to Jesus?
Sorry?
Why do you think God said, Moses, hit the rock with a stick? Okay, how does that speak to us of Jesus?
No.
Okay, when you think about it, how did Jesus give us living water? How did he give us the water of salvation? It was by dying on the cross, right? It was Jesus' death on the cross that brought forth salvation, water, the wellspring of salvation for us.
I thought that is blood.
Yeah, but there's different, they're called metaphors or pictures that God gives us of what he does. So, as therefore with joy we shall draw water out of the wells of salvation. Okay, so it's like drinking. If you remember the woman at the well, Jesus said, give me some water. She says, why are you asking me? He said, well, if you knew who asked you, you would ask me for water, because I will give you living water that springs out from you and will never stop. So Jesus is that living water. So when he died on the cross, he was hit with a stick. Okay, they beat him, they nailed him to the cross, and then out of that came the water of life. So in the same way, when Moses struck the rock, he was demonstrating that Jesus was going to be struck for us. He was that spiritual rock that was. So we can partake of that salvation every day. Every day we have that new life. Every day, if we sin, and we all do, we sin with our mouth, we sin with our thoughts, we sin with different things that we do. Every day we can come and confess our sin, and he's faithful and just to forgive us our sin and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So he is that wellspring of salvation. Okay, so these are all pictures of Jesus. Then there's a war with Amalek. The Amalekites, they come and they see the children of Israel, so they attack them. And so Moses goes up on a hill and he lifts up his arms. And as he lifts up his arms, Joshua and the children of Israel are battling down there. And when he lifts up his arms, they start to win. And when his arms go down, they start to lose. So he has to keep his arms up. And so he gets tired. And so Aaron and Hur, two leaders, they come and they lift up his arms. Moses sits on a rock and they hold his arms up so that the battle is won and they defeat Amalek. And so that's a picture, again, of how God has different people that work together, how we uplift and uphold each other, and that it's through unity that we overcome and we win a victory. And so Moses was doing his part, prayer, lifting up his hands to God, and Joshua was doing his part, fighting down there on the ground and doing the battle. So it's kind of a picture that we pray and we trust God, and God is the one that's going to give us a victory, but he also uses us in the midst of the battle. We have our part to play. Like Joshua, we have our part to play, but we also trust God and receive power from God to do what he's called to do. And so that's kind of a balance there.
Yeah.
Okay, and then chapter 18, Moses' father-in-law comes to see him, and he sees Moses is spending all day. There's a big long line of people, and everybody wants to find out what, the answers to their problems, and they want Moses to make judgments. And so there's this huge lineup, and all day Moses is doing this. And so Moses comes along and says, you know what you're doing, Moses? You're wearing yourself out. You're wearing the people out. You need to delegate authority. And so he makes leaders over tens and leaders over hundreds and leaders over thousands. And so they become the judges. When people have a problem, they go to them. And then if there's a real big problem that nobody can seem to solve, then they can bring it to Moses. And so this is an important area of leadership that God challenges us, that we can't do it all ourselves, that God has given different gifts in the body. So it speaks in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11, it says, God has given apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors, and they all work together for the perfecting of the body of Christ. So we need more than just one man. We need the whole body to work together and function together. And everybody does their part. Sometimes we kind of see ministries where there's one guy and he seems to be he's the be all and end all, and everybody looks to him. But that's not the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a working together of the body, functioning together, bringing forth life. So as you said, you and your wife serve together, you're working together, and then God has brought this other lady to help you. And you each do different parts. You have different things that you do, but each part is important. And we all have that part, and we couldn't do it alone. We need the helpers that God gives us.
Yeah.
Okay, so then in 19 verse 4, God speaks to him and he says, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you will be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel. Okay, so in this, again, we have the protection, we have the provision, we have the presence of God, and he's speaking this, and he calls them to keep his covenant. So as we go into chapter 20 to 40 and on into Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, it's all about his covenant that he makes with the children of Israel through Moses. This is a further covenant then, still under the covenant of Abraham, but now they come under the covenant of Moses. And there's a lot in that. But notice that he says, you are my special people, a special treasure that I have chosen. And so God says, I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you out so that you could be special to me. And you will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And then we see in 1 Peter 2:9, the same thing that Jesus says to us through the Apostle Peter, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So just like the children of Israel for the time under Moses, they were the chosen people that God had chosen to show himself through. Now we, as those who are saved, we've been called out of every tongue and tribe and nation, and God has made us a royal priesthood. He's made us a holy nation. He's made us his own special people. And so Christians throughout the earth proclaim his praises and bring glory and honor to him. That was the purpose of Israel. That's now our purpose, to carry the gospel of Jesus Christ and to shine wherever he's placed us, so that we can bring light to the people around us. All right, so that's the first 19 chapters of Exodus. Lots of stuff in there. God setting the people, bringing them out of captivity again. Jesus has done the same thing. He has brought us out of the world. He's brought us out of the sinful world and brought us into his kingdom. And he set us free through the blood of the Lamb, through his Passover offering. Now we are his special people, planned for his purpose. All right. So any questions or thoughts about that?
Sorry?
Is there anything questions or thoughts about the first 19 chapters there?
Yeah, I was really challenged about the blood and water issue.
Mhm.
I really didn't have an answer to that.
Mhm.
Yes, but then when you brought up the living water, that he said in his word that whoever is in me is like a tree that is planted by the water,
Yes.
fresh waters, and it shall bear fruit season in, season out.
Right.
So all these things now come back. I get to understand, okay, yeah, somehow they're related. Living water and blood.
Yes.
So it now makes sense, but it didn't make sense then. If you realize when you asked, I was really puzzled.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they have two different purposes. The blood is the covenant, and it's the thing that washes our sin, cleanses our sin. So the blood has that purpose. It's that thing that brings us into relationship with Christ. Water speaks more of the provision. Okay. So the blood is the thing that brings us into relationship. So that's that presence of God. We now are no longer strangers. We're no longer separated from God. We're brought into relationship with God again. That's what that brings. Water is the provision. And so it's the provision of, like you say, that tree planted by the waters, or the sheep that are led by still waters, the thing that refreshes us day by day. We drink of the water. And so those are, it's a different thing. We have that water that refreshes us every day. And of course, blood also has a protection. So in Revelation 12:11, it says they overcame him, speaking of the devil, by the blood of the Lamb. So that blood is the thing that protects us from the power of death. So we have those three things of the covenant as well. Okay, so that's good. All right, so the assignment for this coming week is to read the book of Exodus from 20 to 40. And if you can study Exodus 32, okay?
Exodus 32.
Yes. What are some of the things that stand out to you in this chapter? So just look at it and see, Lord, what do you want to speak to me out of this? What is here? And then how is Moses like Jesus?
Okay.
Next week, we're going to cover quite a bit. We're going to cover Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Come again?
Next week, we're going to cover Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Don't you think that's too much?
No, I think we can do it. It's because that's all basically the law. So we'll look at those books of the law and just cover them in fairly brief order. Get a sense of what law is all about. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording here.
Okay.